The stone is already in his hand. It's early morning in the temple courts, and the dust hasn't even settled from the crowd's footsteps when a woman is dragged into the middle of the courtyard and made to stand there, alone, in front of everyone. A circle of scribes and Pharisees closes around her. Somewhere in that circle, a man who was with her the night before is walking free. Nobody asks where he is. The accusers turn to Jesus, and they're not really looking at her anymore, they're watching him. This is the question they came to ask. Does he side with Moses, or does he side with mercy? Either answer ends him. And then, instead of speaking, Jesus bends down. He says nothing. He reaches out with one finger, and he starts writing something in the dirt at his feet. No one in that courtyard says what he wrote. Not the scribes who saw it happen, not the woman standing 3 feet away, not the disciples who told this story for the rest of their lives. 2,000 years later, we still don't know. But maybe that's not the detail we're supposed to be chasing. To understand what's actually happening in that courtyard, you have to understand what kind of mourning this is. It's the Feast of Tabernacles, one of 3 pilgrimage festivals that brought Jewish families from across the region into Jerusalem, packing the city and its temple courts with worshippers for a week. Days earlier, those same courts had been full of ceremony, water carried up from the pool of Siloam and poured out at the altar, massive golden menorahs lit at night, their light said to reach across the city. It's a festival built around provision, memory, and light. The kind of week where Jerusalem doesn't just fill with people. It fills with expectation. And into that expectation, Jesus has already caused a problem. Days before this scene, he'd stood in the temple and taught openly, and the reaction split the city in 2. Some believed he was the Messiah. Others wanted him arrested on the spot. Temple guards were actually sent to seize him, and came back empty-handed, telling the chief priests, "No one ever spoke like this man." The religious leadership is embarrassed. Their own officers went out to make an arrest, and came back persuaded instead. So by the time we reach the scene with the woman, this isn't Jesus' first encounter with these men that week. It's a continuation of a fight they've already started losing. Now hold that against the political reality sitting underneath everything in Jerusalem at this time. Judea isn't an independent nation. It's a Roman province, governed by a Roman prefect, with Roman soldiers stationed at key points around the city, watching for exactly the kind of crowd unrest a festival week could produce. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, still holds real religious authority. They can teach, interpret the law, and pass judgment in religious matters. But there's a hard line they cannot cross. They do not have the legal power to carry out an execution. That belongs to Rome alone. Later in this same gospel, when Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate demanding his death, they say it themselves, almost in frustration. It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. That single restriction changes everything about what's about to happen to this woman. Because under Mosaic Law, the prescribed penalty for adultery is death by stoning. And if the scribes and Pharisees actually intend to carry that out, right here, in the temple courts, during a pilgrimage festival, in front of a crowd of witnesses, they're not just applying Torah. They're staging an execution Rome has explicitly forbidden them to perform, which raises the real question standing behind this whole scene. Is this actually about the woman at all? Because look again at who's missing. The law is specific here. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy alike, the command isn't "the woman caught in adultery shall be put to death." It's both of them, the man and the woman, together, given the same sentence. Adultery, by definition, requires 2 people. And if she was truly caught in the act, as the accusers claim, someone was caught with her. He isn't in this story. No name, no mention, no explanation. A woman is dragged into public view, alone, while whoever was with her the night before walks free, unnamed and unaccused, somewhere outside this circle of men. That's not a small oversight in a legal case built on eyewitness testimony. In Jewish law, a capital charge required multiple witnesses, and those same witnesses were required to initiate the punishment. They didn't just testify, they threw the first stones, taking direct responsibility for the death they were demanding. which means the people standing in this courtyard aren't neutral observers. They are, by their own account, witnesses to what they're calling an act of adultery, which means they were watching, which means someone chose, very deliberately, which half of that act would be dragged into the temple courts this morning, and which half would be allowed to disappear. So this is the world the scene is actually built inside. A festival city, still buzzing with a divided crowd and an embarrassed religious council. A political system that has stripped local Jewish leadership of the power to execute anyone, making a public stoning not just a religious act, but a potential act of open defiance against Rome. A legal case missing half its required participants, brought by men who are simultaneously acting as accusers, witnesses, and judges, and Jesus, already a marked man in that city, standing in the middle of it, being asked a single loaded question in front of a crowd, still deciding what to think of him. This is not a spontaneous moral dilemma that wandered into the temple courts that morning. This is a trap, carefully built, with two possible outcomes, both of them fatal, either to the woman or to him. And it's worth reading, slowly, exactly how that trap was set. The scribes and Pharisees don't open with an accusation, they open with a citation. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? It sounds like a simple appeal to Scripture. But notice what they're doing with that phrase. What do you say? Not what does the law say. They already know what the law says, they just quoted it themselves. What they're asking Jesus to do is put his own name on top of Moses's command, in public, on the record, in front of a crowd still deciding whether he's the Messiah or a threat to be removed. The question isn't designed to get an answer, it's designed to get a quote. Think through both directions this can go. If Jesus says yes, stone her, he's just endorsed a public execution that Rome has explicitly forbidden the Jewish council from carrying out, which means he can be reported to Roman authorities as inciting the exact kind of religious mob violence Rome existed to prevent. If Jesus says no, let her go, he's just publicly overturned Moses in the temple courts, in front of the same crowd he's been trying to convince he honors the law and the prophets. Either answer becomes a weapon. Either one can be repeated later, out of context, to whichever audience needs to hear it, Roman soldiers or Jewish worshippers. It's the kind of question a lawyer asks when he already knows there's no good answer, only a version of the answer he can use. Jesus knows it too, which is exactly why what happens next matters so much. He doesn't answer, but the silence itself creates a new problem, because in that culture, with a crowd watching, silence in the face of a direct legal question doesn't read as neutral, it reads as something. So the real question becomes, what is Jesus actually doing with that silence? Jesus stooped down and wrote with his finger on the ground. That's the entire description. No explanation of what he wrote, no indication of language, letters, or words. Just a posture, stooping, an action, writing, and a surface, the ground. Here's what's easy to miss. In the entire gospel record, this is the only time we ever see Jesus write anything. Not a letter, not a scroll, not a teaching set down in his own hand. In a story where nearly everything Jesus does gets remembered, quoted, and repeated for 2,000 years, this single physical act appears exactly once, and nobody tells us what it said. There's actually a deeper layer to this mystery worth being honest about. Most modern scholars who study the ancient manuscripts of John's Gospel have noted that this entire passage, the whole encounter, writing and all, is missing from the earliest and most reliable Greek copies of John that we have. It shows up later in the manuscript tradition, and in some of those later copies, it appears in different places entirely, after a different chapter of John, or even inserted into the Gospel of Luke. That's not a fringe theory. It's the mainstream position among textual scholars across denominational lines, including many who still regard the story itself as an authentic, early tradition about Jesus that was preserved and eventually written down here. That matters for how we hold this moment. It doesn't mean the story didn't happen. It means the physical record of it has its own history of being carried, copied, and placed, much like the words Jesus wrote in the dust that morning. Even the passage's own survival has passed through hands that couldn't quite pin it down to one fixed location. There's something fitting, if unintended, in a story about words that vanish, having a transmission history that shifted from place to place before it settled where we read it today. Set that aside for a moment and go back to the blank space in the text itself. In a gospel that records entire sermons word for word, this one act of writing, the one thing the crowd could have simply read for themselves, is the one detail left out. Think of it like a courtroom sketch artist who draws every face in the room in exact detail, except the one item sitting on the evidence table. The eye goes straight there, to the blank space, precisely because everything else is so specific. That blank space matters for what this video is actually about. If the claim is that this moment isn't really about content, it's about redirection, then the content being withheld isn't a loose thread the story forgot to close. It may be the whole point. The writing doesn't need to say anything for it to do something. But the accusers don't stop. They keep pressing him for an answer, which means whatever Jesus is doing on the ground hasn't ended the confrontation yet, not until he finally stands back up. When they continued asking him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." On the surface, this sounds like a moral principle, a general statement about hypocrisy, the kind that gets quoted completely detached from its original scene. But notice something specific. Jesus never says the woman is innocent. He never overturns the law. He doesn't say, "Don't stone her." He says something far more targeted and far more dangerous to the men standing around her. He tells them who is allowed to throw the first stone. This is where the earlier legal detail becomes essential. Under Jewish law, in a capital case, the witnesses weren't just there to testify, they were required to carry out the sentence. Deuteronomy is explicit. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death. Being a witness wasn't a passive role. It came with direct physical responsibility for the death that followed. So when Jesus says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone," he isn't offering a philosophical aside about the nature of judgment. He's speaking directly to men claiming to be legal witnesses to this woman's sin, and quietly reminding them what that role actually requires of them. It's the legal equivalent of turning to the accuser in a courtroom and saying, "You first, you specifically, the one who watched closely enough to testify to this." Not "none of you are good enough to judge her," something sharper. You are the ones the law requires to act first, so act. And that's the moment the trap he didn't build starts working against the men who built it. And they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, even to the last. This detail moves fast in the text, almost too fast to notice, but it's carrying real weight. Of everyone standing in that circle, the oldest men leave first. Why would age matter here? One reasonable explanation lies in something nearly universal across long lives. The longer a person lives, the longer the list of things they know about themselves that no one else does. The eldest men in that circle weren't necessarily more guilty than the younger ones. They'd simply had more years to accumulate the private record every person eventually carries. Whatever Jesus said, whatever he did or didn't write, it landed on people old enough to recognize their own reflection the fastest. It's the difference between a young apprentice and a veteran craftsman standing in front of the same flaw in a piece of work. The apprentice might not see it yet. The veteran sees it instantly because he's made that exact mistake himself, more than once, over more years. This is where the pattern sharpens into focus. Jesus was never handed a case about a woman's guilt. He was handed a case built to force him into declaring himself either Rome's enemy or Moses's enemy, and instead of accepting either label, he turned the courtroom's gaze around, one witness at a time, until the men who came to expose her were walking out of the temple courts, having been exposed themselves. Oldest first, down to the last. The accusation didn't get answered. It got mirrored back to the people who made it. And that leaves one person still standing in the circle, the one the entire trap was actually built around from the start. There's a story most of the Jewish worshippers standing in that courtyard would have known well. even if we don't often think of it alongside this one. In the additions to Daniel, a book known as Susanna, a virtuous woman is falsely accused of adultery by two elders who had tried to seduce her and, when refused, turned around and accused her instead. The community believes them. She's condemned to death until a young Daniel steps in, questions the two elders separately, and exposes the contradictions in their story. The accusers are the ones who end up facing judgment. The falsely accused is vindicated by someone wise enough to look past the accusation itself and examine the accusers. It's worth being careful here. There's no evidence John's Gospel is deliberately drawing on Susanna, and the two stories differ in real ways. The woman in John isn't said to be innocent of the underlying charge, and Jesus isn't cross-examining witnesses the way Daniel does. But the shape of both stories would have felt familiar to a Jewish audience. A woman accused by powerful men, a community ready to condemn her, and a single figure who refuses to accept the accusation at face value and turns the moral weight of the moment back onto the accusers. Whether or not John's writer had Susanna in mind, it shows this kind of reversal. Accusers becoming the exposed was already a recognizable pattern in Jewish storytelling, which makes what Jesus does here feel less like an isolated improvisation and more like something that resonated with a much older instinct in Israel's own literature. That true judgment sees past the accusation to the accuser. There's one more detail in this scene worth slowing down on, and it's easy to walk past because it looks so small. He wrote with his finger. Not he wrote, not he made marks. The text specifies the instrument, his finger. It's such a plain physical detail that it barely registers as anything beyond stage direction. A man crouches down, uses his hand, writes in the dirt. That's all it looks like on the surface. But that exact phrase, the finger of God, isn't new to Scripture. It shows up centuries earlier, at the foundation of the entire covenant relationship between God and Israel. At Mount Sinai, when God gives Moses the law, the same law being weaponized against this woman, the text describes how those commandments arrived. The tablets, we're told, were written with the finger of God, not handed down through an intermediary, not spoken and later transcribed, written directly by God's own hand onto stone. Stone, permanent, carved, meant to last. Now hold that image next to the scene in front of us. A man crouches down in the temple courts, the same location built to house the very law that was once written on those stone tablets, and he writes, not on stone, not with a chisel, with a finger, in dust, on the ground. The same phrase, the same instrument, an entirely different surface. It's worth pausing here, because this is the kind of echo that's easy to dismiss as coincidence. Writing by hand wasn't unusual in the ancient world, and finger isn't an unusual word to use for it. That caution is fair, and it should be said honestly. Scripture doesn't tell us the author intended this connection, and no ancient commentary confirms it was deliberate. This is a resonance worth noticing, not a hidden code being decoded. But it's not the only place that phrase appears. In Exodus, when Pharaoh's own magicians can no longer replicate the plagues devastating Egypt, they say something almost involuntarily, a confession pulled out of them by what they're witnessing. This is the finger of God. Later, when Jesus casts out demons during his ministry, he describes his own authority the same way, by the finger of God. In both cases, the phrase marks a moment when divine authority becomes visibly, undeniably present in a physical space, not through speech, through action. So look again at what's happening in this courtyard. The law was first written by the finger of God, on stone, at a mountain, establishing permanently, unchangeably, what sin costs. And in this scene, centuries later, in the very city built around that law, someone is again writing with a finger, not to establish a new commandment on permanent stone, but to write in ground that a single gust of wind, a single footstep, could erase by morning. Not stone, dust. Not a permanent record, something that disappears the moment it's written. If this connection is even partially intentional, and it's offered here as a resonance to notice, not a proven fact, It suggests something quietly significant about what's happening in that courtyard. The same hand that once wrote a law that condemns is now, in this scene, writing something that doesn't last, something the wind takes back before anyone can read it twice. That fits everything else this passage has been doing. Jesus was never asked to erase the law, and he doesn't. He upholds it, activates it, even forces the witnesses to reckon with what it actually requires of them. But the record he leaves behind isn't stone, it's dust. It vanishes, which means the trap the accusers built, the one designed to end either in her death or his destruction, collapses into something that leaves no permanent accusation behind at all. No tablet, no inscription, no written case against her that survives past that morning. The law that was once carved to last forever is still standing, untouched, in this scene, but the accusation against her isn't written in anything that lasts. It's worth noticing, too, what comes immediately after this encounter ends. In the very next verse of John's Gospel, still standing in that same temple courtyard, during that same festival week, Jesus makes one of his most striking declarations. "I am the light of the world." It's said in the same space where, days earlier, giant menorahs had blazed over the festival crowds as part of the Tabernacles celebration. Light that tradition says could be seen across much of the city. Whatever one concludes about how these two scenes were originally connected in the text, the placement is fitting. A woman was just dragged out of the dark corners of an accusation and made to stand in the middle of a circle built to condemn her. And the next words spoken in that same courtyard are about light exposing what darkness had hidden, not to shame it, but to end its hold. If this is the first time you've noticed how many layers were sitting underneath one short, familiar scene, that's exactly what this channel is built to do. Slow down and look again at the parts of Scripture we've read past too quickly. If it's helping you see this story differently, consider subscribing, because there's a lot more sitting underneath the passages we think we already know. And there's still more to this one, because there's still someone standing in that circle. The scribes and Pharisees are gone now, walked out, oldest to youngest, until the courtyard has emptied around her. But the woman hasn't moved. She was placed in the midst of that crowd at the start of this scene, and she's still standing in the midst of it now, except the crowd is gone, and the only person left facing her is the one man in Jerusalem who was never actually on trial for her sin in the first place. And that's where the text does something almost nobody expects. Look at it all at once now. A festival city, still humming with light from the menorahs, still divided over who this man is. A council of religious leaders, embarrassed by their own guards, looking for one clean way to end the argument. A woman dragged into a courtyard alone, the second half of her accusation quietly let go, somewhere outside the circle. A question built with no safe answer, a silence that should have looked like weakness, and a hand moving in the dust. That's the whole scene. Small, physical, almost forgettable if you're reading fast, but slow it down and everything in it is doing something. The law was carved once, on stone, at a mountain, a record built to outlast the men who received it. And here, centuries later, in the shadow of the temple that law was written to protect, a different hand writes again, not on stone, in dust, not to make something permanent, to make something that disappears. The accusers came holding a verse. They left holding nothing, no case, no stone, no accusation that survived the walk out of that courtyard. Oldest first, then the next, not because someone told them their sin, because something made them remember it themselves. He never answered their question the way they wanted. He never had to, because the trap was never really about a verdict. It was about who would be left standing at the end, and who would have to look at their own reflection to get there. Every accuser walked in certain of who the sinner was. Every accuser walked out, less certain of everything, except themselves. Not a ruling, a mirror, not a courtroom. A confrontation with the one thing none of them had come prepared to examine. She's still standing there when it's over, still in the same spot she was placed in at the start, but the circle around her is empty now, and the only person left is the one who was never really the one on trial to begin with. The law wasn't erased, the accusation was. And somewhere at their feet, already fading, already being lifted by wind and footsteps and time, is the only written record anyone ever leaves of a trap that Jesus never fell into, because he was never trying to win it. He was exposing it, one name at a time, beginning with the eldest. There's a version of that circle most of us have stood in without ever calling it that. Not a courtyard in Jerusalem, something smaller. A conversation about someone who isn't there to defend themselves. A story you repeat about a person's mistake because it's easier to talk about their failure than to sit with your own. A moment where you felt, quietly, the relief of being the one holding the stone instead of the one standing in the middle of the circle. It's not a comfortable thing to notice, but it's a human thing, because the accusers in that courtyard weren't cartoonishly evil men. They were religious, careful, sure of the law, sure of their own standing, sure, right up until they weren't, that they belonged on the side of the circle that gets to judge, not the side that gets judged. That certainty is familiar. Most people carry some version of it. It's easier to see clearly what someone else has done than to sit alone with what we've done. It's easier to bring a case than to become one. That's what makes the eldest leaving first so quietly devastating. It wasn't a public unmasking. No one pointed at them. No one read their sins aloud the way they'd tried to read hers. They simply had enough years behind them to recognize, without being told, exactly what Jesus' words required of them, and they knew, before anyone else in that circle did, that they couldn't meet that requirement. Maybe that's the part of this story that lands closest to home. Not the woman, not even the accusers exactly. The moment of private recognition. The instant a person becomes aware, not accused, not shamed publicly, just quietly aware, of the gap between how sure they were and what they actually are. And here's what the text doesn't do with that moment, which might be the most important thing in the whole scene. It doesn't rush past it. It doesn't force a confession out loud. Nobody is named. Nobody is humiliated, the way the woman was humiliated at the start. They're simply given room to walk away, one at a time, at their own pace, unwatched by anyone except the man who exposed them without ever once raising his voice. That's not nothing. That's a specific kind of mercy, the kind that convicts without crushing. And when the last accuser is gone, the only person left standing with her is the one man in that courtyard who had the standing to throw first, and didn't. Neither do I condemn you. Not because the law didn't matter. Not because what she'd done was suddenly fine. He says it next, go and sin no more. The sin is never denied. But the verdict she expected to hear, the one that had already been decided by everyone else in that circle before Jesus ever opened his mouth, never comes. That's the ground this whole story has been standing on from the beginning. Not a courtroom where guilt gets erased. A courtroom where the one person qualified to convict chooses instead to let the accusation dissolve like something written in dust. Not because it never happened, but because condemnation was never the thing he came to hand out. Maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment before this ends, not as a lesson, just as a question left in the dirt, the way he left it. We still don't know what he wrote in the dust that morning, but maybe that was never the mystery worth solving. The mystery worth solving is what he wrote out, every accusation that circle came in ready to make, gone before the wind even had to take it. If this is the first time you've seen this story, slow enough to notice what it's actually doing, that's what the Scripture Project exists for. Consider subscribing. There's a lot more scripture worth this kind of attention. And if someone in your life needs to hear this one, it might be worth sending it their way. Thanks for being here.